There we go. Right. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name's Becky, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the English Association, and the EA is
Yeah,
hosting
I'm here.
today's conversation.
Just quickly.
There we go. I'm just going to do some quick muting. Yes, so this is part of the Decolonising the Discipline programme of events, and we're very pleased to have our speakers with us this afternoon. I'm going to hand over now to Victoria, who's going to chair the discussion. I'll be here keeping an eye on the chat, so if you have any technical issues or you have any questions, we'll make sure that we fold those into the conversation. Okay, so Victoria, take it away.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Becky. So I'm assuming you can hear me. Great, thank you. Welcome everybody to this event on decolonising the curriculum. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. It's so brilliant that so many people are turning up for this, which really is a clear signal that it's a very, very important and timely topic. So I'm very much looking forward to this. So basically, just to remind you of the kind of remit, what we're talking about, we're bringing together educators from secondary and higher education to explore what it really means to have a diverse curriculum and what we might mean by decolonisation in that context. And I'll just kind of keep reminding you of those two things as we go along. I'm Victoria Bazin. I am Associate Professor at Northumbria University, and I'm chairing this session. Before I introduce the panelists, I just want to plug a project that I'm running called Liberating Histories. It's basically a project that talks about women's movement magazines, but as part of that project, we've developed some A-level material to support the teaching of The Handmaid's Tale, the set text, the AQA set text. And all that material is freely available on our website, and our website's called liberatinghistories.org. Liberating Histories, all one word, and it's freely available to download. So if you're teaching The Handmaid's Tale, then please do have a look, and we would love your feedback if you've got any. Okay, so I'll stop plugging myself. So basically, when we were doing the project, we started to work with teachers and students teaching English literature, and we started to become introduced to the whole subject of diversity and this kind of push towards diversifying the curriculum. And so I'm really, really kind of delighted to be welcoming our two panelists today who will be kickstarting this discussion for us on diversity. So I'll give a very, very brief introduction to both those panelists before giving them the opportunity to say a few words about diversity and decolonisation. And then after that, we'll open up the discussion to everybody in the room, basically. Becky and I will be fielding the chat, but also it's always lovely if people want to unmute and actually ask a question kind of live. That's great as well. So we'll be trying to keep on top of the conversation like that. But as I say, before we really start with the questions from the floor, we're going to hear from two experts in the field, people who are very experienced, and as I say, who have a great deal of expertise as well. First of all, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. John Perry from the University of Nottingham, former head teacher with loads of chalkface experience. Since joining Nottingham, John has led the secondary English PGCE, as well as teaching on master's courses and leading on the university's SCITS partnerships. His PhD on place, purpose and production in secondary schools is also the basis of and has been extended into numerous articles in journals. And so I think that some of what John will be talking to us today will be based on his own research. We also have Benny Cara with us. Benny is a former deputy head teacher in the East Midlands, specialising in curriculum development, teaching and learning. She writes and trains on diversity in the curriculum. And alongside supporting schools to diversify, she's the author of A Little Guide for Teachers, Diversity in Schools, and that's published by Sage Education. And she's written on the subject of diversity for publication in publications such as Schools Week and the Chartered College of Teaching's Education Exchange. I'm sure both Benny and John will elaborate further and talk to us more about how their experience has informed their research and also informed the work that they're doing on diversity. And for now, I'm going to stop and I'm going to invite Benny to say a few words about her position and what she thinks we mean by diversifying the curriculum.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. My initial thoughts on this, very much based in the research I'm doing, is I'm in the middle of writing a new book called The Diverse Curriculum. And I've been examining the ways in which the curriculum, in particular subjects such as English, have been influenced by different structures, some of which we are conscious of and some of which we are less conscious of. And I like to imagine it as a triangle. You know, we often think in triangles in education, don't we, with taxonomies and hierarchies. And at the bottom of this this triangle that I'm envisaging in my head is what I call the macro level of influence on the curriculum. You know, the reasons we teach what we teach, and the reasons we exclude certain material. That macro level forms the foundation of so much of the other levels. That's why it's important to be positioned there at the bottom, holding everything up. And that macro level is very much around the systemic bias towards Western European knowledge, as a byproduct, particularly of colonial endeavour. And what I mean by that macro level is often that kind of unconscious absorption of what we deem to be valuable in our education system, in our curricular models. And if we think about the Eurocentric models of thinking, and how they have influenced the curriculum, it's actually really, really interesting, or certainly interesting to me, that quite often Eurocentric models of the curriculum are based on binaries such as reason versus body, subject versus object, culture versus nature, masculine versus feminine. This is researched by Bertino, Prigiano and Landa from the 90s and the 2000s. And of course, what that leads to, those binary models, is that racialized and heteronormative positionality of content. And we see that knowledge of male Western minds as superior. There's also the notion that European history is universal, and European knowledge is universal. And so we almost kind of create this model of what is acceptable from primitive to modern in our heads as to how the curriculum should demonstrate its thinking. And certainly that Eurocentric model is based on differentiating from others. So non-European narratives are seen as backwards or inferior or savage. And I'm interested in how that has an impact, not on individual teachers, but first the meso level of thinking and influence about what we teach, particularly in English. And that meso level, I place the national curriculum very much in the center of that. You know, how does the national curriculum appear in the way it does? Of course, in 1988, in the discussions in the mid-80s, the work was driven by shadowy figures, you know, very hard to pin down who they were and what their interests were in the subject working groups that happened before that 1988 iteration of the curriculum. But certainly when we look at how it's been influenced since, there's been some real shifts in consciousness. So whereas it was about employability, you know, are we equipping young people for the future? It became a kind of national or a nationalistic endeavour. And as you know, the Gove years in 2010 to 2014, I think it was, the phrase "the best of what has been thought and said" started to pop up. Now, that Matthew Arnold sentence fascinates me because it's formed the basis of thinking of what goes into the English curriculum, and is used as a kind of almost clarion call against diversity and decolonisation. But I'm interested in the fact that the quotation is truncated. What Matthew Arnold actually said was, and I'm reading it here, "Culture being a pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know, on all the matters which most concern us, the best which has been thought and said in the world." Now, those words, "in the world," are often left out of the kind of Govian cries to kind of traditional knowledge and the idea of the knowledge-rich curriculum. And so we've got to think that meso level is very much influencing what happens in the classroom. And in turn, that is influenced by that macro level. Where we see problems is in the narrowing of the lens as we grow older through the curriculum. So Key Stage 1 and 2 in English provides a relatively loose structure in which to kind of really think about diversity in English teaching. By the time we get to Key Stage 4, the sentence, read and appreciate the depth and power of the English literary heritage, appears in the programme of study. And so we go from this relatively broad basis to actually, let's look at the literature of a nation. And I'm always fascinated as to why art is called art and literature is called English literature. Why is that the case? It's the only subject that has a nationality attached to it, unless it's a foreign language, a modern language rather. And so for me, it's that kind of sense of, yes, we're narrowing the lens in the context of some quite fraught political engineering, I suppose. And of course, that then knocks into what happens to exam boards. Exam boards are commercial entities, but they're also influenced by the prevailing discussions of the day around what is seen as valuable and what is not seen as valuable. And of course, they are throwbacks in some cases. They're still teaching the same content that they taught very much a long time ago. And that MISO level is very much, again, made up of the national curriculum and exam boards. So when we look at who's influencing exam boards, we also see Michael Gove popping up in 2014, deciding what needs to be taught, and how that relates to kind of national identity and consciousness. And so we need to then think about, actually, what's the micro level of this triangle. The micro level involves actual individual knowledge. Now, individual knowledge around the curriculum is very much built on our own experiences, and we are, I suppose, influenced by the things that we've been taught in the cultures that we've lived in. But it's also that micro level is also about the resources that we have, the time that we have, the familiarity we have with what we're teaching. And it's very difficult to diversify when time and resources and our own experiences don't lend themselves to that kind of process. And so for me, we're thinking in practical terms about what we can do about that. Now, schools have a responsibility to diversify because we know the impact that has on young people. But what can they actually do to do that? Well, firstly, provide calendared time with a clear mandate to update subject knowledge, but also provide ring-fence budgets for membership to subject associations, and funding for subject association membership that comes from the school rather than from the individual, as well as encouraging people to attend CPD, focusing on developing diverse knowledge. So those are the three levels that I kind of I'm situating my my opening in. And I just want to go back to my experience as an English teacher. As someone now who focuses entirely on diversifying and decolonizing the curriculum, I'm actually shocked and appalled by the curriculum that I put in place in many of the schools that I worked in. And just to recount that, I am a product of a Western education. I grew up in inner city Leicester, in a population of young people that was 99% South Asian, but all my teachers were white and the curriculum was very white. And so we didn't really encounter diversity in terms of race. There was some in terms of gender and disability, I have to state. When I grew up, I went to Warwick. I studied the curriculum at a university that was very much a white curriculum, a very heteronormative curriculum at that time as well. And then went on to teach in schools and took that knowledge with me. And I was desperate to present my curriculum as the best of what has been thought and said. That was my rationale. I wanted to present to young people these kind of cultural ideas that I grew up to believe were better than any other cultural ideas and knowledge. And that was very much a kind of internalized racism and internalized colonization, I suppose, of what knowledge meant to me. And it's taken me years to unpick that. It's taken me years to unpick why it was that I had white writers and male writers. And even when I had the chance to write a curriculum from scratch, it took one of my students to say, "Miss, you're really interested in LGBT and feminism. Why is your curriculum not including any of that?" It was a child that told me that. And of course, I looked and I thought, I've made some really big errors here. Yes, I've got powerful women in my curriculum. It's diverse in that sense, but they're all horrible human beings. I have Lady Macbeth. I have Abigail Williams. I have Curly's wife. None of those women are particularly strong role models for our young people, and very much play into that kind of Eve stereotype, I suppose. And so I know that I am subject to the macro, the meso, and the micro level of knowledge, of influence on the curriculum. But to me, that idea of diversifying and decolonizing is recognizing that first, recognizing that we are all products of these big structures, and the structures that kind of encase us as we teach. And once we are more aware of that, we can go through the processes of unpicking, and I often talk about it as unlearning those structures, so that we are able to perhaps look at the marginalized, the hidden, the ones that have been pushed into the non-desirable binary, and really think about how they play in the English curriculum in particular. And what I've realized is that ultimately, I've provided a really narrow lens on literature in particular, because I've been so influenced by those levels. And language in literature is so rich, and it's so rich, and it is a global endeavor. And that's now what I'm trying to rectify through my teaching and my training in schools. So yeah, I'm not sure if that was 10 minutes, but that's me in a nutshell.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Benny. That is just, my goodness, you covered a lot of ground. That's absolutely brilliant. And thanks so much also for reflecting personally, on your own experiences, because that's really helpful as well. Great. Okay, so John, you're up next.
Thanks. I'm kind of wishing I'd gone first, because I don't quite know how to follow that now. That was, I could sit and listen to that for the rest of the afternoon. It's really fascinating. I always feel it's slightly fraudulent at events like this. I am the kind of living embodiment of the middle class, middle-aged white man who kind of the curriculum sort of represents in many ways. And I think it's important to kind of get that out there in the first place. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to say a little bit more about the context that I come from, the context in which I work, and then I'll say a little bit about some of the problems that we see with the curriculum, and suggest some kind of tentative ways that teachers I work with are finding kind of to work around those problems as much as they can. So as I said, I'm Dr. John Perry. I work at the University of Nottingham. I've worked working mainly with PGCE students on the secondary English programme since 2017, and we also work with a number of SCIT programmes, and I lead on those. And I absolutely love working with beginning teachers. I think they are incredibly brave people who do an incredibly brilliant job, and it's a real privilege. Prior to working at Nottingham, I was an English teacher. I began in 1993, so quite a long time ago now. I began working in Derby, and then became a head of English at a secondary school in Cornwall, which is where my roots are. And in January 2010, I became head teacher of a secondary school in Cornwall. And then, of course, in May 2010, Michael Gove became Secretary of State for Education. And it kind of took an interesting turn there. So I was at a school that was academised. It began as a local authority school and was academised, and that had I no longer work at the school. Clearly, it wasn't necessarily to my tastes, and I think it's important to be clear about where we're coming from there. My interest in diversifying the curriculums come from my research into the place, purpose and production of English, which, as was said at the outset, is work I did for my doctoral work. And what I did was I worked with heads of English in about 10 local secondary schools, all of which are in ex-industrial communities. So I wasn't working in the cities. These are all schools which are often bypassed physically and kind of metaphorically. They're not the kind of schools that get researched very often. Most of the schools are in communities which would not normally be categorized as being diverse. Certainly in terms of ethnicity, they are the number of adults in the communities that those schools serve, the number of adults who identified as white British in the most recent census range from 85 to 95%, and you can see that in the schools. But it became very clear very quickly, talking with the heads of English in those schools, that they recognised the fundamental problem with the curriculum, the English curriculum that we have, in that it is completely unrepresentative of modern British society. It is extremely similar. I'm that old that I did O levels. Okay, I was the last year group to do O levels, and the curriculum that is taught in schools is almost identical to the one which I did in my grammar school in Plymouth. Okay, and the teachers are really conscious of this, that such a curriculum does not serve in any way the country. It's not good at all. And I think it's important to put this in the context of the wider school system. I'm just going to read, I've got this on a screen over here. I'm just going to read a quote from the most recent white paper, the most recent education white paper, which talks about the education system, because I think what we're talking about here is in many ways just one example of a system which, according to, well, not the most recent Secretary of State for Education, this was 2022, so we're probably, God, I don't know, 6 or 7 Secretaries of State ago. But anyway, this is the most recent white paper, which says the system that has evolved over the past decade, this was 2022, so this is the decade, you know, since the coalition government. The system that has evolved over the past decade is messy and often confusing. This confusion can have damaging consequences for children, especially the most disadvantaged and vulnerable. And I find that a refreshingly honest admission, but one which has seemed to be overlooked. But I think pointing out, the government itself pointing out that the system we have is damaging for the most disadvantaged and vulnerable, and I think we could add marginalised children into that. It should be a real wake-up call to policymakers that things need to change. Now, the problems for me, I think there are kind of short-term, medium-term and long-term problems. The problems for me identify not only about content, but that's a very, very obvious content. I think there are also problems with assessment, and I think there are problems with the way that the structure which Benny identified earlier, that is evolving, and a new structure is becoming embedded, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So the problems for content, Key Stage 4 clearly dominated by this very, very old-fashioned curriculum, so tightly led by assessment, by very high stakes assessment, and everybody understands the importance of the GCSE in particular for secondary schools, and nobody is going to ignore that. However, there are schools which are trying to find ways to kind of wedge in other kinds of texts to try and diversify things. And I see Dr. Lorna Smith is part of this call. She's putting a book together at the moment. I've just done a chapter about literary non-fiction. And literary non-fiction, preparing students to take that element of the exam, that is an area where the exam boards are trying to introduce a degree of diversity. It's nothing like what we would like, but it is an attempt. And I think there are ways in which teachers can introduce a more diverse range of texts and authors into that element, but also in ways which support the teaching of the literature curriculum. There are more opportunities in Key Stage 3, and I know many schools are working very hard to introduce a really good range of authors. However, and to return to one of Benny's points, budgets are going to be a real issue here, as is teacher knowledge. Teachers don't always have the breadth of knowledge of a diverse range of texts, particularly when what they have been taught at school is the narrow curriculum that we currently have. And this is where a new structure is becoming embedded. So there are pressures there. There are opportunities, but you've got to be brave and you've got to be confident to take those opportunities. So that for me is in some ways not an easy win by any stretch of the imagination, but it is an area which schools can begin to address if they have a supportive SLT and if they work in a supportive trust. And we know that there's a whole kind of range of approaches to curriculum design and a whole range of approaches to budgetary control, and we can't escape those. Okay. The reason that there is such a kind of focus on these texts clearly is because of the GCSE, and I think we need to really start considering reform to the assessment structures and the assessment processes. I know that exam boards are starting to look at this. I've been talking to exam boards over the past 6 months about this. Yes, they are constrained by the government, but I know they're taking a real serious look at not just the range of text to be included, but also they're starting to ask questions about the nature of assessment itself. I know that some organisations are like the English and Media Centre are asking really powerful questions like, what would a curriculum look like without assessment? And they are working with schools in Key Stage 3 to start experimenting with that, which is very brave. You need an exceptionally brave head teacher to support that. But those people are out there, and people are starting to ask these questions. For me, and I'm going to make a guess here, I would imagine quite a few people on this call this afternoon, I think the move away from 100% terminal examination is something which we really need to consider. The heads of English I worked with would be very reluctant to go back to the kind of coursework that we had during the GCS, during the earlier iterations of the GCSE years. Various issues with that, being pressurized to ask kids to redo and redo and redo a piece of coursework until it hits the target that that the school has been set. Various reports of schools supporting, coaching, adding a little bit too much value to individual pupils' coursework, perhaps, so that it met targets. What Michael Gove called gaming the system, but if you set up a competition, people have to win, especially in the high stakes environment we're in at the moment. So I think for me, I think we need to be looking towards a much more portfolio approach to assessment, and a form of assessment which involves not just the written word, much more about speaking and listening. I know the heads of English I work with are very keen to give speaking and listening its due weight rather than this rather kind of tokenistic position we're in at the moment. But I think we could be looking at even more diverse range of assessment. Performance, we could be looking at drama work, we could be looking at all sorts of different ways of presenting our knowledge about language and literature. It doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be confined to an examination sat in a hall for a few hours. That certainly doesn't seem to be one of the 21st century skills that employers are looking for. They want pupils who are confident going out there in the workforce, being able to solve problems and being able to present effectively and collaborate, with their peers, which is something the current curriculum doesn't always encourage. The longer term issue I think that we're facing now is the idea of the current curriculum, inadequate as it is, as we've described this afternoon, as many others have described. Rob Eagleston has been very eloquent on this, Ian Cushing, people, this is, a well accepted idea now that the English curriculum is not fit for purpose. To change that, we need to do a lot, particularly because a lot of the students that we're seeing coming in to study PGCE courses, the current English curriculum is the only one they've known. That is their model of school English. The heads of English who I've been working with, a lot of those are very experienced. They've been teaching for a long time. They've seen different models of the curriculum. They're very rooted in their own sets of values. They understand their communities very well. I'm really concerned that the students coming into the profession are highly motivated, really dedicated, but their understanding of English as a school subject is going to be inevitably constrained by their experience. That is a really big indicator of future practice. And their experience is this, Michael Gove model, for want of a better word. We need to be working really hard to make sure that those people understand that that is just one version and that there are plenty other models of English out there. My preferred model, the thing which I'm most interested in, is harking back in some ways to Brian Cox's models, but where he talked about cultural analysis and personal growth. I'm very interested in the idea of a cultural growth model. So a model of English whereby we work with pupils so that they understand that they can help culture grow, that they can help, shape the place of themselves and shape their own cultures as they move forward. To do that, schools will need agency. Schools are in different contexts, and we need a curriculum which enables schools to reflect that in their curriculum. We're a very long way from that at the moment, but who knows what the next 12 or 18 months will bring. And I'll stop talking then, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Really great, really interesting. And it's so fantastic that you've both, obviously your presentations kind of overlapped and they're on the same subject, but actually you were addressing sort of different issues to a certain extent and taking us in slightly different directions. So thank you both very, very much for that. So basically we're going to open up for questions now. So if people would like to put things in the chat, or if they would like to unmute, I would invite them to do so now. Maybe raise your hand as well so that we can see where you are. I'll give you a few minutes to collect your thoughts. There's a lot to think about. I've got loads of questions, but I'm going to just, I'm not going to say anything. There we go. Leslie, have you got a question for us?
Yes. So firstly, thank you so much, John. Thank you, Benny, for all that you shared today. My question, well, first of all, I wanted to say, Benny, thank you so much for sharing your the way that the curriculum has personally impacted your experience, because I think that sometimes there's an assumption that when talking about these matters, as though we've been like, it's been done perfectly from the very beginning. So thank you so much for sharing that point. The question that I wanted to ask was around your point in relation to the ways to how do I say, improve your recommendations, how to improve. So calendar time, ring fence a budget, and attend CPD. And I wanted to know whether there was anything within that around, or you'd considered anything within that around the kind of support in terms of the difficult conversations when speaking about race in the classroom, just kind of about pedagogy and so on. So yeah, sorry about all the beeping as well, guys. I'm not as popular as it seems.
Firstly, hello again. We have met before. and I'm very impressed with the work that you've done around a lot of this conversation. So it's nice to be having a conversation again. The solutions, I like to think practically, and I like to think about what schools can do tangibly to make a difference. And of course, you know, when I talk about ring fencing funding for subject knowledge, in that subject knowledge is not limited to our knowledge of text. It extends to our knowledge of social identity, marginalization, colonization, racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, all of those things. You know, I work with so many amazing people who are providing training on the kind of basics of those aspects of identity. And for me, where I've seen schools really flourish in moving the conversation forward, it's been in watching them go through the process of understanding what anti-racist approaches are, understanding what heteronormativity is. They have that basis first, and then they apply that to subject knowledge. They apply that to the way that knowledge has been constructed in the curricula that they've been subjected to. And, you know, in terms of the solution, it's not just about the subject knowledge. It's almost kind of inverting that triangle. In fact, putting something else at the triangle, putting us at the bottom of the triangle and saying, actually, our subject knowledge, our curiosity, our development should form the basis of what goes into the national curriculum and feeds into exam boards. And then at that tip, we've got the kind of diminishing colonial impact, I suppose. So if we flip the triangle around, perhaps we've got a better model. You know, I'm trying to conceptualize it in my head, and I'm not sure I'm quite there yet. But what I do know, and something that you'll be familiar with, is the work of exam boards, and how actually teachers have been quite influential in saying, actually, this is not right. We want something new. And you know that the exam boards that we've worked with have held conversations to that effect. You know, what can we do differently? And yet the problem persists, because exam boards are saying we'll diversify content, we will provide you with these diverse materials, decolonized kind of approaches, and yet the teachers teach what they always taught. And that, again, I think is around resourcing and familiarity and time and budgets. So, you know, it's not for want of trying. I think the exam boards, as much as they sit in the center of this, are making those efforts, but they're not necessarily there yet. And I'm not sure they are also aware of those baseline issues of anti-racism and decolonization yet. I don't think they're quite there. And I think I understand why that is, but I'd probably get quite political if I went on that track.
Thanks very much for that, Leslie. Do you want to come back in, or are you okay?
I wanted to say thank you for that response there, Benny. Thank you so much. And lovely to see you again too. And I actually had one more question. So I don't want to take up too much time, but it's for John. And it was around the ITE group that you teach in terms of the PGCs and so forth. To what extent do you share, just in terms of what Benny was sharing, in terms of teachers selecting these texts now? And I appreciate that it isn't all about content, but for the moment, the curriculum is very much steered by what's on the assessment. So to what extent do you encourage or inform PGCE students to think about selecting a text that isn't necessarily the conventional one that is on the curriculum, or that they've learned when they were studying themselves? Yeah.
Thanks, Leslie, and really, really great to see you again, I have to say. This is something that we work a lot on. What we've been asking them to, we've actually been asking them to work a little bit with the new range of texts from AQA to have a look at those. And what we've done in a rare outburst of generosity from the university, they paid for us to actually buy the books for our students. So each student got an entire novel, which is quite unusual. And we've worked with schools to encourage them to use those in their schemes of work. So that's been good. I mean, Are they now being used universally in secondary schools across the region? Absolutely not, because you're right, the teachers are falling back on what they know. But another thing that we've done, which we're quite pleased with, is that we've asked students where they are teaching, say, Jekyll and Hyde or Christmas Carol, is to choose a complementary text from a different author that can sit alongside that to help the student, to help the pupils understand more about the text that is on the curriculum. So it would be naive to say to our PGC students, go in and tell the head of English they're not going to teach a Christmas Carol anymore, we're going to do this. But we're saying, think about something that you can do that is complementary to that. And we do point them very firmly, very strongly, and very regularly to the Lit in Colour website, which I think is a fabulous place for any of us to start. So they're small steps. I think one of the issues that some of our students and colleagues find is they are uncomfortable with some of the conversations. They're uncomfortable at teaching some of the content. They and different schools obviously have different approaches to the kind of language you can use. Ultimately, we say to them, you've got to do what you are comfortable with. We wouldn't want somebody teaching in the way that they feel kind of makes them feel inauthentic or puts them in a difficult position. But that varies from school to school and from teacher to teacher. And I think people need to have some agency there. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
it does. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Leslie. I've got quite a few things coming in on the chat. So the first question is from Ruth Rose. I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but I'll read it out. I teach at an independent school still on IGCSE. What would you suggest to diversify our approach to texts like Of Mice and Men, which obviously has a number of problems?
I can go on this one. So I'm sorry if I've got a leaky face and I'm rolling my eyes out loud, and not at you, Ruth Rose, at all. It's I'm fascinated by the concept that Of Mice and Men is the seminal early 20th century text. That it is the be all and end all of literature, of that period, of that space and time, of that geography. And I've had so many arguments. There are so many arguments about it. It's an investigation about power. It's a highlighting of hierarchies. It's it's quite sympathetic to crooks, actually. And I struggle because, firstly, it's there by an accident of exam board choice. Right? It was there because the exam boards chose it. They put it into the GCSE. Because we had all of the texts, it didn't go away when Gove got rid of it. It went into Key Stage 3. Right? It's there because someone said at some point we should teach it, and then we carried on teaching it for many years, and we couldn't get rid of it. And actually, it's a really problematic text. I'm sure many of you will know this, but actually, all of the marginalized characters end up remaining marginalized or dead. And for me, yes, Steinbeck might be meditating on the nature of power, but he doesn't provide any agency. And for me, it's a really problematic text in that I think it teaches our young people, firstly, that you can use language that is objectionable in the classroom in the name of good literature, which has always been an issue. And secondly, that actually, imbalances exist, but we can't change them. And to speak to the point that John made about the complementary stories, in my conceptions around diversifying the curriculum, I have 5. The second one is around parallel stories and paired texts. And if you must teach Of Mice and Men, I think it's firstly imperative that we think about being very explicit about the nature of marginalization in the novel, and the lack of agency of those characters, and the inevitability of their demises, but then also to say, what else is there? You know, what else exists? And I don't mean turning to Gatsby. I mean turning to the Harlem Renaissance. I mean turning to Lorraine Hansberry potentially, and really digging into early 20th century America from those different lenses, those different viewpoints. And the point of parallel stories and paired texts is it allows that multi-perspectivity to take place. To borrow a phrase from historians, you know, the multi-perspectivity of English is really important too. Similarly, when we teach Jekyll and Hyde, you know, when we look at the character of Mr. Hyde, he has a kind of unspecified disability, which is horrific. You know, there's a scarification, the hunchness, the you know, the disfigurement of his face, and yet we don't have parallels in the curriculum to really counter some of the narrative that creates and reinforces through the literature over time. And so I can't, you know, it is for you to say to your school, your exam board, we teach IGCSE. Do we have to teach IGCSE? Yes, we do. We're in an international school. Okay, what else can we do? That's a conversation. It's really tricky. But there's also just the pointing out, actually, of the lack of agency and the problematic nature of it, if that's the very least you can do. So sorry, that felt like quite a rant. I apologize. The Michael Wren question,
that was actually sort of really helpful, and sort of in that, you know, my personal approach and the approach of my department is we do talk about the lack of agency. We do, you know, our department policies that there is language we do not use out loud in classrooms, etc. Because we have students of colour sitting in the classroom, and as a white teacher, there are words that I am not comfortable having my students need to hear over and over again. So the fact that you've kind of reassured me in that the approach that we're taking within this sort of narrow corridor that we find ourselves in is sort of in the right direction. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to move things along, and I'm going to move down to another question from the chat, and this is from Shahia Zafir, and she is saying, I'm currently in the process of co-writing the ITT curriculum for next year, and I'm writing 6 of the 12 two-hour sessions I've not been directed but have deliberately chosen to include a session on diversity in the English curriculum. Are there any reading materials you could direct me to, or anyone willing to look at what I have created so far? So I get, you know, suggestions about reading materials in the first instance.
I would go genuinely. I would go straight to the Lit in Colour report. I think that is such a fantastic place to start, and the research report that goes with it is has a host of, you know, really good references, and I would start there personally. I'm very happy to have a look at stuff, but I may not be the best person. I don't know. You know.
I think certainly for me, I go text specific on this. So rather than thinking about the kind of broadest diversity in English umbrella, to go think about the kind of texts that come up, the common texts, and to look up the academic research that goes around race and gender and sexuality and disability, particularly around those texts. So, for example, you know, the teaching of Jane Eyre and the racialization of the characters, and certainly kind of the binary opposites that exist there, the disability narratives in Jekyll and Hyde, and in something like A Christmas Carol. So I think going text specific really does help. Because actually there's very little written around diversity in English. Once I finish this book, maybe maybe I could get started on another one. Who knows?
Thanks for that. That's really useful. I just want to read out something from Madeline. She's talking about having the courage and time to tackle the research required to dig deeply into new texts. As she says, exam boards are working hard to decolonize, e.g., as you've pointed out, already Lit in Colour initiatives. The problems are, and you both touched on this, teachers having the headspace to rewrite schemes. And I mean, you know, yeah, it takes a lot of time, doesn't it, to do these things? So, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Is there more to say?
Sorry, I was just going to say in the interviews I did with the heads of English, they were all you know, absolutely clear that they hardly get any time with their departments to do anything anything developmental. You know, and all of us who've worked in schools will recognise this. You might meet as a team, you know, perhaps once a half term, and that's usually something to do with data or moderation. You know, I suspect the days of, you know, taking a day off timetable to go off site and with a blank bit of paper, I suspect those days are kind of gone, and you know, you will need to work with your senior leaders to try and carve out that time. Schools in trusts might be able to do something. I know there are some very good subject directors who are quite active in trying to get that sort of time together, but that is, you know, we're in a system that is messy and often confusing, as the government said, and this is a major problem, which needs addressing. I'm not sure we can answer it fully this afternoon, unfortunately.
Thanks for that. I'm going to move on because I've got lots of chat and also now a lot of hands raised. So let me go to Kanupriya. Kanupriya, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry if you're hearing the background noise because the neighbors are constructing something. So yeah, but I'm sorry, I'm not from the English subject. And I'm also, I think most of the discussion here is oriented towards school teaching, whereas I run the Decolonizing Criminology Network at Cambridge, and I'm a PhD student. So my question comes from that space of criminology, and criminology is an offshoot from sociology, which is quite a wide discipline and has roots in colonization. But you know, my question is geared up towards resistance and how do we respond to resistance? Because most of these initiatives, at least, you know, in your space, are taken up by people who have positions of power. But when these initiatives are being taken up by students like myself, who are the most precarious situation, how do we respond to resistance? So for instance, whenever I talk about decolonizing the curriculum within criminology spaces in Cambridge, their response is always first the defense of familiarity, that they're not familiar with other cultural contexts, and they are, you know, how do they find resources at the time to search for these, you know, readings that are not pertaining to their familiar backgrounds. Secondly, they did say that, you know, a lot of international students who come to Oxbridge or, you know, Oxford and Cambridge want to learn about Western contexts because, you know, they've already learned about the context that they come from. Just, I don't believe in this, but they sort of like give this defense. And third, they do talk about, you know, the master's and PhD courses as being very autonomous and independent, where students are encouraged to research about the context that they are interested in, and that's not the staff's responsibility to provide them with such content. And I often find myself like dealing with these questions. Of course, I have my own responses, but how would you sort of respond to such defenses in your spaces? And a lot of students, in fact, also come and say that how do we decolonize or learn about decolonization when we don't understand criminology from its very roots? So how do we balance teaching a subject without, you know, teaching the essence of it first and then comes decolonization, or does it come parallel to each other? I don't know. I think I'm just confused in my own thoughts now, but yeah.
Benny, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I can have a go. The resistance part, I think, is really difficult because resistance is born of defensiveness and a real kind of positioning your own ego in the middle of the discourse, which we are all prone to do, you know, which is, I don't know. I'm scared of getting it wrong. I feel shame. I feel like I'm being blamed. There's all sorts of narratives going on there, I think, when you meet resistance to this work. And to me, you know, where I've met people who have challenged the concepts of diversification and decolonization, I've had to remind people that as teachers, we have to remain scholars. And our scholarship is something that happens daily. It's not something that happens once in a PGCE or in a degree, at BA level or MA level. It's something that is ongoing. And I often use the example that I didn't learn how to teach. I didn't know inherently how to teach Dickens. I had to come to that. I engaged in a process that meant that I was able to teach plot and structure and narrative and theme and nuance and language. And that was a kind of disciplinary inquiry for me. And in the same way that I learned how to teach Dickens, I have to now learn how to teach other texts that are, not necessarily canonical texts. That is my responsibility as an educator. And I often use the joke that quite often when people think that when we're diversifying and decolonizing the curriculum, we're trying to replace Shakespeare with Stormzy. And I will always say that this is an argument for more knowledge, not less. Always more knowledge. We're saying you have to know better, you have to know wider in order to select our way through a curriculum and a body of knowledge. Christine Counsell talks about disciplinary knowledge as a kind of biggest disruptor, in the sense that, what we teach is not all there is. And I think that's vital for us to remember and to transmit to our students, because that's an act of disruption in itself. We're saying this is one pathway through the knowledge. And, do we teach the tenets first? I find it very difficult to answer that question, actually. It's a kind of deep philosophical question that I'm not sure I have the brain power to deal with. But in English, I think, do they need to understand what a book is? Yes, they do. Do they need to understand what a novel is? Yes, they do. But I don't think you can teach those things without talking about colonial discourses, and I don't think that those things can be separated, and they shouldn't be separated. So yeah, I'm not sure that answered the question, but that's where my head is going at the moment.
No, absolutely. I think you answered most of it. But yeah, I mean, a little bit, if either of you can comment on how do we sort of respond to this as a student, the lowest in the hierarchy, because if the staff is not very much involved in these initiatives.
Well, certainly, I mean, the ability to protest is your right, and you do that in the structures that you have. I don't necessarily have an answer to that one. Maybe John has an answer to that one. I'm not sure where I'd stand on it.
Well, as I said, as the middle-aged white man, my position is different, but I do recognise the issue. I really do. We, much as I rail against the canon that we teach, in terms of GCSE and Key Stage 3 content, I'm also very conscious I teach a canon of dead white, mainly French men in my in other areas of my work. I'm teaching Bourdieu, I teach Foucault, I teach Henri Lefebvre, and while they've all got valuable, interesting things to say, there are plenty of other voices out there as well. But changing that mindset, changing that structure, I think is really, really difficult, particularly when you are working with people who have in some ways helped us develop the tools to recognize that structure. Their work is of worth, but obviously it's not the only work. And as Benny said, this is, I think, the one thing that I want to take away from today is diversification, decolonization. It's about more knowledge. It's not about replacing one knowledge with another. And in schools, I've never heard a teacher seriously suggest that we ban the teaching of Shakespeare. The most recent Ofsted report says that schools risk replacing high quality texts, and I've never seen that. Nobody would want to do that. We want to add to the knowledge, and it's like Benny said earlier. The Matthew Arnold quote is about the best that has been thought and said in the world. Without wanting to get too political, if we want to be a global, have a global presence, perhaps we should be cognizant of what is happening across the globe rather than happening in the kind of schools that I went to as a child. But I'm not sure that really gives you any practical advice. Sorry.
No, thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to move on to Anshuman Mondal. You've had your hand up for a while. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm just I want to come in here as somebody who works in higher education and you know, as part of the group that sort of this Decolonising the Discipline group that's sort of hosting this, and talk about how we can help, how we in higher education who have been working on this for, in my case, 20 odd years, can help teachers with our expertise. And I'll just give one example of this. We at UEA are working with a local schools trust to provide some CPD around this issue. It's a conversation that was brokered by the English Association, in fact, as part of their kind of initiative to create hubs between universities and schools. And I think, you know, we're doing it in the first kind of this is the first year that we're doing it, so we'll have a meeting at the end to see how it's gone. And hopefully this will be able to then continue further so that we can help not just the current academy trust that we're helping, but also other schools that we can help by sharing our expertise and providing some of that assistance that I'm hearing is really wanted. But I think to turn it into a question is, you know, tell us how best can we as a sector, with those of us who have worked on, you know, it's a very well-established field in terms of post-colonial studies, moving into sort of what we might call decolonial studies. How best can we take our expertise to help you develop what you need? Because our context is very different. We have control over our curricula and so on and so forth in terms of our modules. But we do have certain shared experiences in terms of the overall undergraduate degree program, which is less easy to kind of shift or change or transform. So I guess you know, how do we start that conversation with different groups of different people in different locations with their local universities into enabling those sorts of shared experiences and expertise to be developed? I think you're muted. I couldn't hear you what you said there.
Oh, apologies. Benny, do you want to go first?
I certainly think what's coming across is there are lots of organisations that are moving towards having this discussion meaningfully. Whether teachers are aware of their presence. You know, the English Association was not something that I was aware of when I started teaching. And that is partly because of the way I came into teaching. I came in as an unqualified teacher. And landed in a classroom and was very much a how do I teach kind of moment. But I certainly think that the visibility of subject associations is hugely important in ensuring that the right information gets to the right people. And I know that the work of the Historical Association and the Geography Association are also hugely influential in things like diversifying and decolonising the curriculum. And for me, it's a case of making sure those lines of communication are clear between those who are in the classroom and those who are in those subject associations, because I certainly felt, and this is not a blame thing, certainly felt that there was a disconnect between what I was doing in the classroom and what was happening in the kind of academic discussion of the discipline. So yeah, so a rather vague point, but I think, yeah.
Yeah, it can be very difficult for schools and HE to connect. This has been a kind of an age old problem, and one of the issues that ITE faces, and I think I've seen it referred to in the chat, is the increasingly sort of centralised direct control of the ITE curriculum by the government, so that there is actually kind of less time from 2024 going forwards. There's actually less time available to teach about such issues, but there are opportunities as well, and I think, you know, schools, if they reach out, they will find kind of willing partners. I know we work with one multi-academy trust in particular very closely. We co-construct CPD to both sort of support their the way in which they work with their pupils to get their GCSEs, because that is obviously fundamental importance, but also to try and do that in creative, innovative ways, which do help them diversify their curriculum in the context of schools that are you know, certainly ethnically you know, very, very undiverse. So yeah, opportunities, but there are barriers there as well.
And Schumann, do you want to come back in, or have you finished asking questions?
Yeah, I'll just say that if you do want some help and so on, just first of all, join the network, join the Decolonising the Discipline network. That way we will be able to know that you're interested in developing some of those conversations. The English Association, as I've pointed out, has already started to create these kind of little hubs between universities and local schools, and I think it's a model that could really work well. But of course, we need to make that connection between the higher education sector and the school sector. And so, you know, do reach out to us through this. This is the whole point of this network, is to bridge that gap. So do let us know you're there and want to talk, and we will then take it forward.
Victoria, you're on mute. This is very 2021, isn't it?
Sorry. I'm getting out of the habit of unmuting myself. So I want to go to Philip Lawrence Hoyt, who's got a question. He teaches English in an FE college in London. He says, I teach a completely decolonised curriculum. I have two questions. To what extent, as a white male, am I still exercising privilege? The second question is, I've had significant pushback from non-white students saying I teach too much Black history and literature, was one of the complaints. So how do I deal with that? So it's a really interesting question.
I'm happy to respond. Well, are you still exercising privilege teaching a completely decolonised curriculum? It's all about positionality, isn't it? That, you know, when you are teaching something in say, for example, a decolonised curriculum, when you are a cis heterosexual white man, able-bodied white man, then, you know, the element of privilege doesn't go away when you're teaching a decolonised curriculum. But acknowledging your positionality in that is, I think, important in considering the lens through which that curriculum is being taught. The decolonised curriculum, I think, can have lethal mutations, I think, sometimes, depending on how it's taught and the lens through which it's taught. Is the decolonised curriculum a curriculum that is seen as one with agency, with value, with worth, or is it something that is a post-colonial curriculum? And I think sometimes those two things get mixed up. You know, are we positioning ourselves as a kind of an apology for what's happening, or are we thinking about the conditions in which it was created? And it's a really complex area, and there's a lot of reading around this, and there's a lot of work around this by people who are far more intelligent than I am. But it's hard to say, I suppose. In essence, if you're teaching a decolonised curriculum, I'm assuming you've decolonised your mindset, and you are aware of your positionality, and you are aware of the nuances of how you present certain ideas. And as for there's too much Black in the curriculum, I think you can always respond with, I'm righting previous wrongs, and I'm foregrounding in an act of equity content that has not been privileged in the curriculum previously, and that is my allyship at play. That's what my response would be anyway.
John, how would you respond to that criticism?
I would essentially defer to Benny. There's nothing I would disagree with there. I think the only thing which I might add would be to consider the idea of co-construction with the students, and think about what's their agency in curriculum construction, and that we need to be careful that we don't develop an alternative curriculum which works in some ways in similar to the kind of the idea that a lot of people now consider defunct, as the idea of poetry from other cultures, where you're essentially replacing one problematic curriculum with another problematic curriculum, even though the motivation might have been more positive. And I think we need to be very, very cautious of that. And for me, the more we can co-construct our curriculum models with our students, with the learners, the better, whilst maintaining the reality that at the end of the day they've got to do an exam, and it's in nobody's interest if they don't do well in those exams. We need to be mindful of that too.
Thank you. Chris Lloyd, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. And also, hi, Philip, who put in the chat that we went to university together a million years ago. So it's nice to see that. So I teach literature at the University of Hertfordshire. And I also run, in inverted commas, the diversifying and decolonizing group that we have at the university. So kind of thinking about that across subject areas. And everything everyone has said is fascinating so far. I guess I have one of those formative beginning questions, which is, do we know what we're doing is decolonizing, right? Like I have endless worries about that word being used, right? So every workshop I do on decolonizing, I make them look at the Eve Tuck and Kei Wen Yang essay, right? Like decolonizing is not a metaphor. It's not a thing you can do. It's a material process of returning land and resources and money to people who've been dispossessed, right? So is changing texts actually decolonizing, or is it just diversifying the curriculum, right? And I wonder what you two think about the kind of dangers or violences of using that word as a kind of catch-all for rethinking or reimagining, right? Like, is violence done by us using this term easily in these contexts, right? And where you want to go with that. So like every time I get further down that line, I'm like, we still haven't answered the first bit of the question, because I go into a room and someone's like, I've got a decolonized curriculum now. I'm like, have you now? Well, you work in a university, do you not? Like, aren't you already screwed? Pardon my French, right? If we're working within white institutions, which they are, right, because they're institutionalized, can we do, I don't know, you know what I'm saying. I just would love to hear your thoughts on that question.
So I think it's a really important point that you've raised there, Chris. I have to say decolonization isn't a word that I use in my work. That's not something I'm particularly comfortable with. I don't think, possibly for reasons similar to what you're suggesting there, I don't feel I'm in a position to decolonize that curriculum. I'm not sure I'm in a cognitive position to do it. I suspect I'm probably too deeply embedded to see beyond the colony to the extent that is required. Now I'm still in a position of authority. Obviously, I design curriculum models. I'm using platforms like this, and I do, as you can probably register, I do have some discomfort with that. However, I still recognise change is needed, and I want to take whatever small steps I can to help those changes. But I tend to stick with diversifying, and partly for reasons I was explaining earlier. I don't want to take much away. There are some things I would take away from the curriculum, but for reasons of kind of personal taste as much as anything else. But I think that we should be looking at adding knowledge and getting a much kind of wider, more global perspective. I'm in the position I am, so I want to use that as positively as I can. But personally, I don't use that phrase.
I tend to avoid it as well, and not because I think there's anything wrong with it. I think that firstly, it took me a long time to get my head around it. And I think when you're starting as a teacher in particular, teaching the English curriculum, you are so immersed in the colonial aspect of literature that it's very hard to then think about how you take that skin and take it off. It very much becomes the skin that you're in. And it's, you know, to extend that metaphor, the idea of being able to take that skin off and being able to walk around and function, you know, I just can't comprehend how that would happen. And I've faced a lot of criticism for talking about diversity rather than decolonization, but I've wanted to reposition diversification as not this pure model of representation and variety. You know, that I think sometimes it's seen as very fluffy. It's seen as, you know, you put more faces on, therefore you've diversified, therefore the job is done. No, I think that diversification has intended effects of the bringing the marginalized to the center, which is an act of decolonization, in order to provide agency, in order to ensure that narratives that have been lost are repositioned in the center. And I think that, for me, that redefinition of diversity needs to happen in our discourses, because I think there's a simplification, a line between those two words that is a kind of, there's a good and there's a bad. Decolonization good, diversity bad. And I'm not sure it's as straightforward as that. I tried to articulate it in one of my chapters, you know, how are these two words intrinsically connected? And they are. You know, you can't have decolonization without diversity. You can't do diversity without knocking into decolonization. I like the idea of your culturally responsive curriculum. The only issue I've faced with that is when people say, well, I've got an all-white classroom. How do I present a culturally responsive curriculum to, you know, 30 white kids? And, you know, then it becomes this conversation about whose culture and what are we responding to? And it's that's the nature of the beast, that you're constantly navigating that space of, where does knowledge belong? Who does it sit with? Where does it come from? Am I qualified to be able to unpick some of this? But I recognize John's reticence. You know, I've felt that same reticence. And I very much admire those who are very much wholeheartedly about decolonization. I just don't think I'm there yet. I think I need to do much more work.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Madeline, have you got a question for us?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, well, my second question, which I'll start with, is Benny, when is your book coming out? Because I need to read it. And the first question is on my the note I put in the chat, actually, and it sort of resonates with everything that hopefully lots of people have said, which is, so basically my background is, I'm multiracial myself, but I think we need to not beat ourselves up about you know, tackling literature that we're not familiar with. So I spent a whole summer digging deeply into Isian Hutchinson's poetry, because I was thinking of using it for an A-level text. And you know, and he's a Jamaican scholar, poet, brilliant stuff, but deeply rich, full of cultural significances that I had zero understanding of. My husband's Jamaican, so I'm asking him all the time, what does this mean? What does that mean? And actually, after that, I sort of felt, do I have the right to teach it, even though, you know, I'm married into that culture? However, my conclusion was, well, wait a minute, we do the same for Shakespeare, right? I'm not a Tudor. You know, I'm not a Victorian. We dig deeply into the past. You know, and who was it that said the past is like a different country? They do things differently there. You know, I think, you know, the chap who spoke earlier with the gorgeous purple nails, you know, that's so true, because I've experienced a lot of pushback, actually, where I teach. With the word diversity, certainly I don't dare mention decolonization, although I'm ragingly doing it anyway. So I think what I'm trying to say is we need to move to a position as a discipline. And I think the point that I think it was Benny made right at the beginning of, why do we call it English literature? That is the key. We just need to look at literature. And I would say go beyond the word literature even, and say, well, hold on, what about throwing in there different forms of text? You know, for true diversification, What about digital? What about spoken? What about media texts? All of these things need to enrich the discipline, as well as race and all the other things as well, so that one day in the future classroom, no one will bat an eyelid. You know, 1 minute you're doing Octavia Butler, the next minute you're doing Charles Dickens, and it's just not a thing. Isn't that the position we want to move to, where it's irrelevant? Do you know what I mean? It's not really a question, it's more of a statement. And I'd love your views. And also, when's the book being published?
Well, if I finish it this week, Christmas 2024, it's 2 years late, so I'm frantic every day now.
No, I think your points are absolutely spot on, Madeline. Although I'm just making a note about Christmas presents for this year. I think the idea about looking at other texts, it's so important. I mean, I said earlier I've been writing a chapter for Lorna about literary non-fiction, and when you know, look at what is the non-fiction that kids read, well, they read a lot. Most of it ain't the kind of literary non-fiction that that perhaps the national curriculum is encouraging. I don't know many young people who sit around reading essays and journalism of the kind that that perhaps the government would like us to read, but they're reading a lot. They're reading a lot of non-fiction. And some of it is extremely influential. We only need to think of the social media presence of various people who we might prefer our kids to be able to take a more critical stance towards, whether they're influencers, whether they're politicians, whoever. But at the moment, one of the big criticisms, I think, of the curriculum is that despite what it says, it doesn't really encourage criticality. But I think if we had a more diverse and a more engaging range of texts and a much wider range of text forms, and broaden that definition of what literary might mean, and broaden the accepted definition of text. I know us as English teachers get it, and it was there in previous iterations of the national curriculum. It was there in the 2007 version. But now it's very much, old-fashioned print-based. But you're absolutely right, Madeline. That needs to be expanded urgently. Victoria, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Very, very interesting point, John, about what students are reading and how they're reading. And how we define literariness, which we've always had a problem defining. It's always been up for grabs, hasn't it? It's not as if we've ever really agreed what literature is, but to invite students to engage in that debate would be useful in itself. And this diversity agenda would encourage students to do that. Ferzine, you have been waiting for a very long time, very patiently. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much, Victoria. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much for a really insightful discussion. In fact, one of the points I wanted to pick up on was this idea of HE partnership with schools, and being as someone who is working in HE as a teaching fellow in English, I just find that we can consider ourselves as part of the problem in how we are advocating some of these canonical texts approaches within institutions that essentially these students are going to be applying to, sorry. So I'm finding that considering some of the changes that I have been bringing about in my own department, I find that these are isolated cases, which I don't know if this is more to do with coincidence or not, but given that I'm the only South Asian colleague there, I have been given this opportunity to radicalize a module, and I certainly have taken that role. And John, I found that the pairing of text really is effective in bringing these conversations and dialogues between texts in front of students and getting them to work it out themselves. I don't think in terms of subject knowledge we need to be really fluent in Fanon or Edward Sayed. We just need that starting point in order to begin these conversations and let the students have faith in the students to carry these on. So I would like to ask if anyone is in the HE department, and also if there have been actual conversations with their local schools within the area that they are within, and how are these conversations taking place? Because I would like to actually begin something like that to ensure that we are adapting and learning from each other, because I don't think HE has got the answer at the moment. Thank you.
So, Fazina, I can start a little bit. I mean, we are working in a partnership with a local MAT. That came about, I have to say, though, simply because it's a bit. I probably shouldn't even acknowledge this. It's quite embarrassing, really. The subject director for English across that MAT, there's about 8 or 9 secondary schools, I think, in that MAT. She is one of her other roles is head of English at the same school that my daughters go to. So I'm in the school. I have that contact with her, and it kind of grew from there. Really, it's nothing more formal than that, and that feels kind of slightly inadequate, really. But what has happened from that is she's then got a second MAT to join with us, so it is growing, but it's kind of word of mouth. It's informal, and I would love for there to be something a little bit more kind of widely known. I'm not that familiar with the work that was referred to earlier by the English Association, and that's certainly something that I will be investigating after today, and seeing if we can kind of work with that as well. So that's the kind of honest, realistic answer, but it's not necessarily that helpful.
No, I appreciate your honesty there, to be honest, and it's nice that there is some sort of conversation going, but like you said, it needs to be done at a more structured and systematic scale. True. Okay.
Philip Smithers, have you got a question for us, Philip?
Hi, I do, yes. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep, we can.
Yeah. Hi everybody. So thanks a lot, first of all, for the session. Like, it's really useful. I just want to get your thoughts on the recent Ofsted subject association of English that was recently published, especially with regards to their comments about teaching texts of inherent literary value, like I said, whatever that may mean, problematic as that is. And they're essentially telling schools, we shouldn't teach texts that necessarily are specific to students' lives, for example, and just like it feels like we're coming up against a brick wall with that, and obviously the influence of Ofsted, and just what you it's not really a question, more your own thoughts on that and how would you deal with it. And
can I start with that one, because this is something I feel quite strongly about. They seem to have a real issue with books about homelessness. In 2 recent reports, they've said, you know, don't teach about homelessness. And certainly in one of the schools that I work with, they're in a town which was experiencing a big issue with homelessness at the time now, and they started teaching Stone Cold. Now, okay, it's you know, perhaps not going to go down in history as one of the world's greatest novels, but you know what? It won the Carnegie Medal. There's it has high literary quality, no matter which way you look at it, and it has content. And one of the things which Ofsted seem to have a problem with is that books are not just about literary techniques, that they're actually about stuff. And the stuff that books tend to be about the big issues. You know, that's what makes them transferable from one generation to another. That's what sustain them, because we keep coming up against these issues. So I think, you know, while we have a society which is you know, deeply problematic, we're going to have people writing about deeply problematic issues. That's kind of what authors do. Now, the fact that some use kind of different levels of literary techniques is fine. No teacher is going to teach a text that they wholeheartedly believe is badly written. You know, we teach because we love English, but we also have to teach content. Every novel has content, every poem has content. So I think the response to that Ofsted report is along the lines of, well, thank you very much for your time. However, we're professionals and we know what we're doing and we know our communities. So thank you. We'll take what you've said with interest. But actually, you know, we know what's happening in our communities, and we are in a position to use some agent, whatever limited agency we have, to develop a curriculum that is appropriate for the kids in front of us.
Yeah, you could probably see my face again. My reaction to that. It kind of feels like, you know, if this was a subject review set in, I don't know, the Victorian times, it'd be like, God, please stop teaching Dickens. He just keeps going on about poor urchins. You know, can we please stop teaching about poor urchins? It's not really kind of the prevailing values of the day. And I feel like it's a real throwback. And I don't know if the people who write those reports, understand the loaded nature of phrases like, you know, valued and heritage and all of those texts. Like, if you haven't been involved in the discourses, you don't know how much those are red flag phrases. And for me, I almost want to kind of write that to them, kind of mark their work and say, you know, kind of say, do you want to just explain this word to me, please? Where does that come from? Because that word was being used in the 1970s by prominent literary critics who said that modern movements towards kind of social issues in literature were the politics of resentment. You know, that was happening 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And yet we're still having that conversation. Why are you still having that conversation? It's frustrating, but I think, you know, we shouldn't lose focus, as John said, on the children in front of us, because they have made it really clear what they want. They want to see themselves represented in the curriculum. They want to hear voices that they don't normally hear from, they haven't traditionally heard from. They want to explore issues. Children love subversion. You know, they love hearing about the dark and the dangerous and the deadly, and they love that's what brings literature to life. You know, I spent hours reading Judy Blume's Forever as a kid, going over the same passages over again. If literature isn't about the joy of subversion, then what is it about? And if we're going to listen to subject reviews like that, I think, yes, I should probably stop there before I say something that I shouldn't.
Philip, do you want to come back in?
No, I'll just say thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much sums up like my own thoughts on it as well, and what seems to be the general reception of that and across the board with the English Media Centre and the English Association. Even Michael Rosen, I think, came in and was quite critical of it as well. So, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and thanks very much.
Thanks for the question. Okay, so I feel that I've moved through the chat. And there's been lots and lots of very positive feedback, lots of fantastic sharing of resources as well. So that's, you know, that's brilliant, because obviously this whole event is a networking event, and it's great to share those sorts of resources with each other. Any other questions in the chat, or does anyone want to come in and just make a contribution, perhaps, if you feel you've got a bit more you want to say on any of these subjects? While you're thinking about that, I might just, and this really goes back to what Ferzine was saying, I think, you know, in terms of her position as a research assistant at higher education institution, which is that I'm still quite surprised and wondering why or how this has happened, that there still seems to be a very distinct kind of line drawn between higher education and education in schools and colleges, and that actually we don't really talk very much to each other, even though we've very much got a vested interest, or, you know, we should be wanting to talk to each other, because we're often kind of interested in the same sorts of things and having the same kinds of debates. So I'm sort of wondering, my question would be, why do you think that we don't have that many of these kinds of conversations? What do you think, Benny?
why I was contemplating. Why do we not have those kinds of conversations between higher education and schools? Schools can be really, really singularly functional places. And for me, there's a practicality and a physicality of what happens in the classroom that means there's very little space, and it's what we talked about earlier, the headspace for the academic and the intellectual, even though that's technically what we're doing. And we get so bogged down in that physicality and that practicality, and we lurch from meeting to meeting. There's that crisis element of what happens in schools, which can be fun, which can be complex, but it doesn't leave time to reflect on what is taught. And I'm thinking really practically about some of the schemes of work that I put in place. I wrote them and my teachers taught them. Did I refer them to anyone? Did I consult with anyone before I wrote them? No, I relied on my own research, my own subject knowledge, my own experience. It was very much a closed thing, and quite often there's that thing in the classroom where you are the king of the castle. And so why would you need to look elsewhere? Why would you need to have those conversations? And yet it's a false economy in many ways. You keep your time and you keep your autonomy, but you don't get that chance to reflect, and you don't get that chance to have the critical response to what you're doing that perhaps you need. The only time you get critical responses on your pedagogy. Even when people talk about good subject knowledge in lesson observation, what does that even mean sometimes? Because they're often not a subject specialist, so how would they know? It's a tricky one, but I do think it's more logistical and practical than it is in terms of what people's will is. It's not volition, it's circumstance, I think.
Yeah, and I think there is a disconnect as well between university English and school English. I mean, I think of my own institution, and I know, if they're teaching about Victorian literature, they're not really talking about Dickens, and so the level of knowledge is so kind of precise and so detailed. So there is this big disconnect, particularly between GCSE and university. I think when with A level it's slightly different. I think there's a bit of a wariness about universities that and I'm in a Russell Group university. I get that, but there can be a little bit of snobbishness nobody could possibly understand what we say. And I think there needs to be sorry, this is being recorded, isn't it? Oh God, I need another coffee. I think that if you're in a school, I mean, I only learned about how universities work by coming and working in a university. If you're in a school, who do you make contact with? Is it the English department? Is it the education department? Who is your point of contact? And it can be incredibly difficult to break through. But I think actually the substantive point is Benny's. If you are a teacher, in your average working day, if you're lucky, by the end of lunchtime, you'll have had a chance to go to the loo. If you're not, if you're unlucky, then you won't have had a chance to go to the loo. You'll have been teaching, you'll have been dealing with social services, you'll have had irate parents on the line, and that's before that's before the end of lunch. So the idea of headspace to think about these things is really precious, and you need a very confident and brave leadership team actually to really carve out and protect that time for departments to work together to think in those kinds of ways. Whether the next 12 months will provide those opportunities or kind of incentivize those opportunities, I don't know. We've been told that there will be a review of the curriculum, how wide-ranging, how deep, whatever form that will take. There will be change coming. We've had the current curriculum for a very, very long time. The average length of a curriculum, I think, is something like 7 years, and I think we're 9 or 10 years into it now. So, the curriculum is going to change. People will have to have time and it would be lovely if schools wanted to work with universities to help them, even if it's not giving them solutions. I don't think we're in a position to do that. I would not go into a secondary school and say, this is how you should be doing it. But I might be able to ask questions that they haven't thought of and offer spaces to think that perhaps they might not have thought of as well. And if I can just draw attention, for finally, before I shut up, if I can just draw attention to Elizabeth Elliott's point in the chat about Tiongo's work, Decolonising the Mind, that's a really good place to start as well. That's a really quite readable introduction, and that's important for teachers as well. It's got to be readable. Academic books, you know, very few people sit down and read Pierre Bourdieu for fun. Let's be honest. Tiongo's work can be read in a sensible way, and also he has some very interesting ideas that can be used for assessment, as I was talking about earlier with the idea of oracy. So sorry, that was a bit of a ramble to hide the fact that I was rude about my own institution earlier. So I'll never talk about that again. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being so candid, because I think there is an issue there. I mean, in my own experience, I recognise that teachers are often too busy to set up meetings with us to come into the university with students, and the curriculum is so packed, it's so densely packed that there's not space in the curriculum for students to come away from their studies of the GCSE, for instance, text that they're doing, to have a kind of more. It seems like students are they very much need support for those GCSE texts rather than doing something that might be just fun for students. You know, they have to be focused on the curriculum and delivering that basically most of the time. But, you know, at universities as well, I think we have to be more proactive, as you say, about going into universities and actually being more flexible, and also listening to what teachers, people who are training to become teachers as well, you know, and actually taking advantage of the fact that we can be more flexible perhaps than schools and teachers, and so we can maybe, you know, support in ways that are more helpful perhaps than we have done recently. Okay, so any other questions or points or observations about this absolutely fascinating conversation that we've been having? I've learned so much, and particularly the supporting material that people have been talking about. I mean, that's just fantastic. Yeah, anything else in the chat or any other observations from people in the meeting? I mean, I'm aware we've got a few more minutes. I don't want to take up time unless we do have that time and there's no one else who wants to ask a question, because I thought what John was saying about assessment was very, very interesting, and how that might link to the diversification of the curriculum. And I wondered whether, John, have you got any ideas about how that might work? What kinds of assessment might be introduced, or how we might move away from the discursive essay, for example?
Yeah, as I said, I think we need. I don't think we can go back to the old style of coursework. That was too open to misuse and a lot of pressure being put on teachers to redo work. But I think we can be looking at, you know, much more creative approaches to assessment. Now, this is something that lots of universities are involved with at the moment. And, you know, looking at much greater use of presentations. I think we need to find ways of assessing group work much more effectively. I think, you know, the curriculums have always been designed partly with employment in mind, but we have an assessment system which doesn't support that. I think if you were to ask employers, you know, what do they want of the next generation? Well, they don't want people who've got a really detailed knowledge of their sector. They understand it's their role to do that, but they want people who can, you know, use good metacognitive skills. They want people who can work together collaboratively under a range of different circumstances. And I think we could have, you know, ways of assessing those. You know, it's not beyond human imagination to do that. You know, you could think of I mean, I'm not suggesting, as a colleague of mine from another university once did with her doctoral work, where apparently she literally knitted a part of her PhD. I'm sure there was much more to it than that, and that's not something I could do. But much more creative approaches. You know, posters are perfectly acceptable in academia for degrees, yeah, but they're not for younger qualifications. So I think we've got to be creative, and it would be lovely. It would be absolutely lovely if we had a type of curriculum model where schools have the agency to design their own assessment systems in a little way like some of the independent schools. You know, they've abandoned GCSEs, they've designed their own assessment systems, which are perfectly acceptable for independent schools. Perhaps it would be great if the same privilege was extended to the state sector. But Ruth is right; we still have to do the GCSE, and it's important at the moment that we are mindful of that and cognizant of that.
The issue for me has never really been about the nature of the assessment, but what it's used for. When we think about the bottom line as a head of English is to provide percentages so that you contribute to your English and maths combined scores for Progress 8 and Attainment 8, the old C grades and above. And, you know, as soon as that became front and center of the discussion, that ability to innovate in English really disappeared, because it was that kind of football manager mentality that if you don't make the numbers, then that's it. You know, I personally love a discursive essay. I know I love linguistic analysis. I recognize that all of those in many ways are kind of colonial structures. That is the way I was taught, and that's the way I think. But I recognize that they're not the only valid forms of response to text, and that, you know, the ability to have a heated debate should form part of the assessment of English. The reaction to a character should form part of the assessment. My interview at Cambridge, which ultimately was unsuccessful, I was asked not, you know, about a theme. I was asked which character really surprised me, and which character really surprised me in a book that I'd read. And I talked about Catherine from Wuthering Heights and how I didn't like her. And actually there was this kind of moment of, wait, I'm not having to give you quotations. I'm not having to justify. I'm not having to provide you critical responses. I'm just telling you what I think. And that's a valid form of assessment. And obviously, clearly it was the wrong answer, but that says something about the nature of the institution, perhaps. But, you know, if unless we move away from that kind of numbers mentality, that's what's being reported, heads of English and English teachers will always be under the cosh, because it goes out of everything, all the good intentions go out of the window when your leadership team are saying, yes, but what are your percentages now? We're in April. What are we doing? You know, how are you getting those numbers up? What's the match with maths? Have you done child by child analysis? You know, so yeah, I find it ultimately quite depressing, and made me glad I wasn't a head of English anymore for the latter part of my career. Victoria, you're on mute again.
Sorry, you see, I am a print culture person. This does not come naturally to me. I would be happy, yes, with essays, A-level exams, you know, the old canon, etc., etc. But nevertheless, I have to move with the times and unmute myself. Ruth, do you have a question for us, or maybe an observation?
I was just going to sort of add to kind of, I fear I came off as very sort of dismissive when I was like, we still have to do GCSE. What I meant by that was, in the context of working in an independent school, we're still tied to IGCSE, which is irritating to me in that, you know, that limits us to things like I say, of mice and men, etc. And I sort of was wondering and kind of observing kind of the way that we are trying to sort of my head of, I'm second in department, my head of department is very keen on introducing diversity in our sort of year 9 curriculum, but then also in our A-level coursework choices. So we are consciously trying to diversify there, which I think is one of those rare places where as English teachers we do have a little bit of freedom. In that I wrote to the board and asked if I could teach On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and they agreed it. But I think from the way she reacted, no one had ever asked that before, which I think is a sad indictment. So basically my observation is that, yeah, independent schools are still fighting, I think, to bring that in as well. Yeah, ramble, sorry.
No, that's great, Ruth, because it's good to get lots of different perspectives on this, and there are different perspectives in different contexts. But yeah, you're right to remind us of that fact. And we've got some lovely more resources in the chat, and you can see there's a lovely poster in there as well. So there's lots of thanks to our fantastic speakers, you know, who both of you, Benny and John, thanks so much. You were just so interesting, had so many kind of fantastic insights into the issues, some great examples of ways to intervene and make changes, but also, you know, I love, you know, the ways in which you can both talk about the kind of context, the longer context of these debates and how things used to be different and then they shifted. So having that historical awareness, I think, is important, because then it does give us, I suppose, a sense that things can change again. You know, let's try and end on a positive note. You know, would you either of you like to say just anything else in terms of concluding remarks?
I can do. It's been really interesting to hear everybody's opinions. I've been following the chat really closely, and I just wanted to say that it's times like this that I'm filled with a little bit of optimism and a bit of hope about the kinds of people who are engaging in this debate, and how committed you are to ensuring that the conversations are maybe different than they have been over time. And then just hoping that if there is a curriculum change, that you are somewhere in the voices being consulted. So please do watch out. That space is changing, and your voices are going to be invaluable in ensuring that we have a curriculum that's fit for purpose, and that doesn't just reiterate old values and old traditions, that just actually thinks about the children that are in front of us. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Yeah, and I guess I'd finish by reiterating that change will happen. Change is a constant. And it's people like yourselves who are committed enough to be here at, you know, whatever time it is, 5:30 on a Monday evening. And I'm guessing for quite a few of you, this is your holiday, this is your leisure time, and you know, to have that kind of level of commitment, it just has to fill us with hope. And I suggest that there are lots of people in this meeting who will be very happy to carry on the conversation and support each other. And on that note, Ruth, if you'd like to get in touch, I'd be very keen to see what you do and understand more of what you do in your specific context. That would help me a lot. But you know, change won't happen unless we do it. So I'll stop.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Becky, I don't know if you want to come in from the English Association just to wrap things up.
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you, Victoria, for your warm and welcoming chairing. It was really wonderful. Thank you. And to our speakers for being so generous with their ideas, our participants for being so willing to share as well, because we all have to be quite vulnerable in these spaces when we're all acknowledging that sometimes we don't know, or we might have been wrong and we're looking to change. And thank you to Matt, who has been assiduously live tweeting away in the background. So we've got a record of all the wonderful discussions that have happened. And thank you finally to Decolonising the Discipline Network for bringing us all together. If you're looking to carry on these conversations, do join the Decolonising the Discipline Network to get news about other stuff that's happening. And we in the EA are going to look to host a sort of really practical workshop on the back of this, which is focused at teachers and, you know, and showcasing work that has happened within schools and colleges, so that we can really sort of get into the nuts and bolts of what we've been talking about today. So keep an eye out for that coming in the future. But now I will leave you to your Monday evening, and to those of you who are on holiday, thank you. Now go and crack open your Easter eggs if you've got any left. And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.